good job of introducing Ian Teh. And I guess the first question maybe is how did I find him? And there's a larger answer, or that's part of a larger question. Many of you have commented to me, and I think also to Ruth and probably to Jennifer, about what an extraordinary group of people we assembled for this institute and how did we do it. And for some of you, we knew you, or we knew people who knew you, and so we invited you that way. But for others of you, I just did massive job of sending out notices and saying, you know, we're doing this and apply if you're interested. And I would send out notices to everybody I knew saying, please circulate this among your contacts. And that produced actually 70 people who wanted to come, and we ended up picking about 25 who seemed to us to be the most interesting. I'm not sure you are the most interesting, but you're sure interesting. So anyway, I think, and I was trying to go through my documentary record today to find out who it was who told me about Ian. I think I sent an email to the Asia Society, and I said, could you please circulate this notice among your contacts? And I can't remember who it was. Somebody wrote me back and said, yes, 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 I'm really happy to do this. It sounds like a great thing you're doing, and you have to invite Ian Teh. And so I did what we all do now these days. I Googled him, and I saw some of the work that you're about to see, and I decided that yes, well, I guess I conferred with Ruth, who then probably also Googled him, and then we conferred with Jennifer, and we decided that we did indeed need to invite him. So that's sort of that's actually how you go about putting together a meeting that isn't just composed of people you've known for the last 30 years. So, and then actually, when I posted notice of this on Facebook, I think it was Chamath, you posted as a response to my posting a 2-minute video in which you talk about your work, which I watched, and there were a couple of things you said in that I thought were particularly interesting, and I think were interesting to the work of the Institute. The first thing you talked about, well, I'm not sure it's the first thing you talked about, but it's the first thing I'm going to talk about, you're talking about, is you're talking about how interested you are in the ambiguities of landscape. And the ways in which you're using a panoramic camera sort of in some ways mimics Chinese landscape scrolls. You talked about your interest in the sense of a dream of a nation, and then you used a phrase which I really liked. You talked about the transactional costs of national dreams. And I think that may be something that we want to think about is that as a concept. So anyway, I think that it's like a 2.5-minute video, and if it turns out he said things in the video that he doesn't say tonight, we can provide the URL. He's written, or he's published 3 books, one called Undercurrents, one called Traces, one called Confluence. His work is in the permanent exhibits of many museums, LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, being one of them. His work has been published in Granta, in Time, and the New Yorker. One of the interesting projects that you're working on is you're a tutor at the Angkor Photo Festival, working with kids, getting them, or not kids, working with
people kind of like young people who are trying to become professional, or I should take photography as want to develop their photography.
So young photographers and photographers to be, and actually when I was reading your website just now, you actually had a show here in 2008 of Three Gorges photographs.
No, that was back in 2003 in New York.
Well, your website says you had at the Minnesota Center for Photography. Maybe some
in Northeast?
Yes, yeah.
But somehow your work's got
yeah.
Okay.
You know you better than I know.
I guess I should always clear introductions. Anyway, I'm very much looking forward to this, and I think I've quite done enough damage. So I think I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Wow. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me here, and to the rest of the team as well. Mine's been hurting the last 2 days listening to everyone talk. And, well, I hope I did a good job with this. I thought, because we talked about, over the 2 days, about different rivers, etc., I thought of one of my earlier projects, The Vanishing, which was on the Yangtze River. And I thought that would be interesting to show you all. I started this back in 1999, and initially I just kind of read it in a newspaper article about this project. And the first thing that captured my mind was the scale of it, the fact that it was affecting 700 kilometers of the Yangtze River. They were going to destroy something like 1,000 cities, towns, and villages altogether. And all I could imagine was these little cities and towns submerged under like 185 meters of water. That wasn't how they were going to do it. They were going to dismantle every city and rebuild it. But it captured my imagination at a point when I was just starting my career fairly seriously, and I thought this would be a project that I'd like to spend some time working on. So that image that you just saw just now was actually the Yangtze River, and this one here shows you the dam that's under construction, and you might just see the boat in the back there. That's like a ferry, it's like a 3-story ferry that travels in there, so you kind of get a sense of the scale of the ship, of the dam itself, which I think is about 1.2 miles wide. So initially, when I first started traveling along the river, I just imagined, with limited resources, and I suppose in those early days, I was always thinking about how am I going to tell this story? Because there were so many different facets to what I was trying to, that concerned this issue. You had the displacement of 1.5 million people, the complete change of the landscape, and how do you organize people moving out in different stages? But there was the ecological damage, and also the worry that the dam itself was actually built on the fault line as well. So in the end, I realized that more than ever, I wanted to document this because it felt like something that was historical, that these places won't exist anymore. And so my journey was really to try and document what happened over the 3 years that I was working on this. So this is Wushan, and a city called Wanzhou, and the bridge, I think it's several hundred years old, and it was just a few days before it was going to be dynamited. And this was around the same time, and that's the old part of town in Wanzhou. And you'd have workers, mostly migrant workers, who kind of left their farmlands to work and get better paid work, destroying these buildings, and they would actually they would either dismantle it by hand with a sledgehammer, wearing many sandals, and then they would also sometimes dynamite these buildings, and this is what it looks like. And at the same time, what was happening was they would also, the government was going through this massive building project, and they were building all these new cities. Some of them ended up being very high up on very steep gradients, and others, where there was enough space, they would actually destroy part of the city, but rebuild some new section higher up the hills. And you can actually see in this section here, the dark buildings in the front are the old city. It's the old city. The bright white ones are in the background of the new constructions. And all of this here used to be a town, but all of that's just been destroyed. And one of the things they do is reinforce the banks of the river with more concrete. And people would move to. So that was the interesting thing when you'd think that people would just. How do they pick up, move, and start a new life? How does one organize that, and how does one person as a family do that as well? And a lot of the places I would travel, I would just go up and down the river, and I'll just keep choosing to stay in small towns that I found interesting. And they were all going through these different stages of destruction, and some of the communities were still thriving in some of these places, but in other places they were slowly hollowing out. So in this little town called Yunyang, all these workers, and in those days they used to have these kind of like guys, they call them, I think, bonbons, and they would literally carry all of these, you could hire these guys to carry all your luggage for you, and they would load up the buses, and from there, because it was higher up the hill, they would drive up to the new city, and people will actually move in that way. The river was used for transporting people, commercial goods, and so this is some of the life that's down there. And some people when people had to move, they were given choices whether they would want to move to the new city, but some people decided to move to other cities further on the eastern seaboard to try and look for work and start a new life. So this is the journey of a boat that was heading towards Shanghai. And as these towns started to hollow out, you'd find like restaurants and places where there would be no people coming in. Little things like I met a woman who used to sell tofu in the market, and because it's fresh produce, it can't last for very long. So when I asked her about her situation, she burst out crying and told me that she used to just walk down to the market and just she'd make the tofu from home, take it down to the market and sell it there. But now, because most of the community had already left, she couldn't. There was no one to sell to, so she'd stopped selling, and but she wasn't in a position to move because she still hadn't got compensation money or resettlement money from the local government yet. So this is the whole family that's traveling on a boat, heading out east. And I remember when I was looking in here that there was these, all around me I could hear dynamites, explosions, and people working and destroying, dismantling the buildings. And I saw these two kids poking their heads out the window, looking kind of confused and slightly frightened, and I went up, said hello to them, and then their maid invited me into the home, and I couldn't really speak that much Chinese at the time, but they seemed very concerned, happy to play by themselves. But it just kind of struck me by how surreal the whole situation was, because you had this very domestic environment, and a lot of the tensions that was being felt was just experienced, you know, kind of inside these people who were just watching and wondering what their life was going to be like in the future. So these workers, you know, would have carried the bricks individually, and they get stacked up. The bricks will get sold or and reused again. And in this building, which I climbed up to the top, and I was photographing them while they were working, I found out on the ground floor they had a woman who was there, and she cooked, because these workers couldn't necessarily, they didn't have somewhere to go to stay. They would stay in the building they were dismantling as well. And for those who couldn't afford to move or weren't ready to move yet, they'd carry on still working while the building was being dismantled on top. So that's a barber shop that's you know, still open, and you can just see this blue mirror here. So whatever that could be salvaged was being salvaged. So you can just see the hand of a worker carrying the mirror. So that's the Three Gorges. I took this on the spring of 2003, just a few days before they were going to start to flood and raise the waters. And in this particular town, I actually stayed in a hotel that was just behind the umbrellas on that flat piece of land just over there. And it was a thriving little town, and by the time I got here, back here in 2003, you know, they've completely leveled the whole city, and this was the last family that was moving out. So the owner of the home was speaking to the workers, and he was talking about selling the bricks away. All his belongings are out there, and they're packed up and ready to go up to the new town. So this is how they fortify the banks of the river, and it's going to be a new harbour. And that's the dam itself. So before I start going into showing you the works on the Yellow River, I decided to work on the Yellow River because of my earlier project. So in a way, this project I'm about to show you is the genesis of what I'm doing now. Back in 2006, when I first started working on this, China was going through this massive boom. It had already been that way, but the world was very impressed by the cities that were along the eastern seaboard. And I was just starting to base myself in Beijing at that time. And I kind of wondered how this was possible. What allowed all the construction, all the buildings along the eastern seaboard, these skyscrapers, what allowed that, where did that source come from? And I started looking back at the root of where where the energy came from, and which was the coal industry. And at the same time, at that time, there was something like 150 million migrant workers who were previously farmers, and most of them were traveling looking for construction work. They were looking for factory work, etc., because they were better paid. So I decided to go to Shanxi, which was the kind of coal capital of China. It's also where the Yellow River passes through. It's where part of the basin is. And that was where I started, and eventually I started going towards the northeastern seaboard of China as well, the northeast of China as well. So this is actually in Tonghua and Liaoning. And I tried to explore the idea of it wasn't just focused on mining, but I started looking at the steel plants, all of the coal industry. And in a way, at that time, what I was trying to imagine was this idea of a dream, a national dream, and at the same time also the individual. At that time, this wave of individuals who wanted to seek a better life. And at the same time, you had this vast industrial space that I kind of saw that was overpowering the individual. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous. So my aim was to. There were a few elements of what I was trying to do with Dark Clouds. I kind of felt that the individual had been lost in the sense that they became anonymous by the process of this wave of the national dream. And in doing so, one of the things that I decided to do was to kind of photograph these industries from dusk onwards and to almost capture the landscape overpowering the individual. So quite often the way I photographed the individual or the people within these landscapes, they were they were anonymous or they were obscured in some way. So that's in a coal mine. And this is back in Tonghua where we had a steel plant here. That's in the communal bath. I was very impressed with these miners when they came out, even after their baths, and they looked so pretty, their faces, and because they looked like they had eyeliners. Yeah. they never went away. And that's in the coking plant. So I'd get inside these factories, I'd get to know some of the workers, and then eventually, at first they would take interest in me, and then they would get bored of me because I would just be hanging around all the time. It was a really weird experience for me to just have this feeling. On the one hand, I was incredibly excited and awed by being in some of these really industrial places. And then at the same time, you kind of knew the price that all of this cost. So that's in a worker's kind of playroom. And every now and again, I'll try and work on producing a portrait. That was my kind of moment of giving the worker a chance to kind of present them as an individual within this kind of anonymous landscape. So that's in a small mine in Datong. One of the things that is amazing is how many of these workers work in these kind of conditions where I think there's a high incidence of black lung disease. And that's in the steak mine in Datong. I don't know what that says, but I've been told that it means international standard. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. For those of you who can read Chinese. So when in this last shot, which is in Linfen, this city was kind of well known for its back in the 80s as the fruit and flower town. But because it had such rich coal seams over the years, it became really industrialized. When I was working on this around that period, I remember when I was driving past in a taxi, having finished at the end of the day, I saw these people who were furtively standing around the forest, and they had these sacks that they were carrying with them, and they had these sticks with some kind of rock attached to it. And I was like, really curious as to what they were doing. In the background, in the distance, that sunset is actually the flame from a chimney from either a coking plant or some kind of factory there. And I remember telling the taxi driver to stop and just let's see what these guys are doing. And they would walk into the forest, and they would take these sticks and they would be running them along the ground, and eventually they'll pick it up, and then they would brush off whatever it's collected on that rock. And then eventually I realized that was a magnet, and they were basically picking pieces of metal that had been raining from the sky. So during one Chinese New Year, just before the Olympics, I decided to carry on working on my project by going back to the coal mines. And around that time, because it was Chinese New Year and just before the Olympics, the government had closed a lot of the factories, partly to stop the amount of pollution, air pollution that was going up and reaching Beijing, but also at the same time, because it was such an important holiday, and for many of these migrant workers, for that 1 week or so, that was the only time they got to see their families. So with these mines closed, I was wandering around trying to look for people to interact with, to photograph, and there was no one. There was no activity that was going on. And in a state of anxiety over the 3 days, wondering what I was going to do for the rest of the week I was going to be there, I started realizing that these landscapes on their own, without people, made you kind of think of what you saw in a very different light as when you saw people within the images. On the one hand, when you see people in a photograph, you tend to kind of think about the personal stories of the people that depicted in the images. But within the landscape, it kind of, on its own, it started to have this more reflective and contemplative mood. So it kind of made you think of humanity's impact on the landscape. So this was actually, after I experienced that, I decided I'd do a series called Tainted Landscapes. And this was in Tonghua, which is in the northeast of China. And just where this plant was, you would always have these industrial complexes where you had power stations, steel plants, coal mines, everything was nearby, and it would feed into this kind of big industrial complex that would feed the whole the city. And at that time, China was building something like, the average was 2 power stations a week. And it was one of the reasons I divided this project into 2 parts. The first part was kind of looking at to document this expansion of this particular power station. And the second part was Linfen, which, so one was looking at the power station, the other one was looking at the kind of satellite of industry that was around this town. And the thing that used to always puzzle me was how agriculture and heavy industry were never really separated.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular area that I was in, just on the outskirts of the town, behind me was actually a coal power station. The road that I'm standing on there is black because of trucks carrying coal to the power station. In front of me, you have agriculture. On the just a few paces down, you'd have a school with children coming out there. Everything was just so closely knit at that time, and it still hasn't really changed. I mean, it's just not maybe as extreme as before because there's more awareness, but. So that's a coking plant. So after that project, I started thinking about getting people to look, because initially when I first shot tainted landscapes, I was kind of confined to a very small format. It was a 35mm. It was my first experiment with doing landscapes that way. And I started thinking, I would like to create almost another series of work that people could kind of lose themselves in, where you could print the images big enough so that you can kind of lose yourself in the landscape. So I started working with the panoramic camera. And the idea of traces was to contrast it with, and it would become an interleaving chapter with dark clouds. So on the one hand, you would see the life within these kind of industrial complexes, and on the other, you would kind of see these landscapes without the people, and kind of have this kind of play of tension between the two. So this is coal waste, basically. It's tailings, and it's just mixed in with snow, and it's just outside this huge industrial complex. That's ash and waste ponds. And the scale of it was enormous, and it was just outside. This was around Inner Mongolia. And then I tried to show some of the economic development that was going on in these places as well. So this is a new residential construction of luxury apartments, but just further, not far down the road, you had a steel plant right next to it. So the town had got incredibly rich over that short period of time. So in this particular town that I went to, it was just on the border of Shanxi, and this is called the Fun River, a subsidiary of I believe the Yellow River, and the town had something like 80% of what was underneath was coal, and it had gotten so rich from all the mining that was going on there. But the coal mining boss that was taking me around in these places at that time told me that the river had started to sink because of all the mining that was going on. And as a result, after it started sinking, the rocks that were at the bottom of the riverbed was being used to, they were breaking the rocks for construction and using the rocks to actually take it out, extract it to use it for making steel.
House?
Sorry?
What is house called?
They're bricks. It's a brick factory, and just behind there you can just see a trace of farmland as well. That's cement plant. So you can just see, like, I mean, they're just different plants all in the distance, and you had trucks coming up on this man-made hill that off just rocks and rubble that they collected from dynamiting nearby mountains. So after having been working on the coal industry, one of the things I felt was that I kind of seen, in a way, the darker side of industry, and I really wanted to find a way to communicate in a more subtle way with my new project. And on the one hand, water was the next issue that I felt was a very important problem that was arising in this area. And I thought, how do I not show the same thing, but kind of think of something, another way to communicate the sense of loss or cost related to development. And in a way, what I tried to do was, I kind of imagined, first I used the river for its cultural significance, its 5,000-year history, and the fact that it was the cradle of civilization for China. And at the same time, I would use text as a counterpoint to what was going on. I was always struck by how the landscape in itself never really showed you. You could be seduced by the landscape and not really understand many of the issues that were going underneath. And my aim, in a way, was to try and go past the boundary of the frame, to kind of think along the lines of how could you show the undercurrents of whether it's economic policy, political decisions that were kind of affecting the landscape. Because basically what you saw was a kind of manifestation, I felt, of not only the natural progress of nature, but of policy as well. So this section of the Yellow River is actually at the plateau. And the interesting thing is, like, back in '97, the Yellow River for many months didn't reach the sea. But currently, if you go back to the plateau, the lakes are full of water. It's got a lot more water than before, and it's one of the reasons, the government says that it has a lot of water is because of the kind of ecological policies that they put in place. But even their own scientists are kind of in doubt as to whether that's true, because they think that a lot of it's due to ice melting in the area, and that's what's filling the lakes. Some of the policies that they had after that late 90s period was to actually remove nomads off the landscape, remove yaks from grazing in order for the grasslands to grow back. And these are some of the kind of houses that they were building to house nomads. And one of the things that some scientists have discovered is that these landscapes were designed for people to roam around, so that you didn't have high concentrations of use in any one place. Building these kind of residential areas or cities, etc., put a lot of strain in a place that couldn't regenerate as fast. So some of the nomads, even though you have these kind of constructions, while it's hasn't been sold, you find like they'll bring their animals and they'll feed allow them to, to graze in these residential complexes. Five-star hotel. It kind of, due to a change of government, their permit wasn't renewed, and so it's just kind of left abandoned. So, in the middle reaches Lanzhou. It's a petrochemical hub. I tried to show a slightly different character to what was going on in the first part of the river. And at that time, without realizing it, when I went out there, Lanzhou had actually become the most polluted city in China at that time for the last couple of years. This is in Hejin, which is on the opposite banks. One of the things that I tried to do was to kind of romanticize the river on the one hand, but to leave some kind of trace of what was perhaps slightly wrong within the landscape. You could probably just see in the background, on the opposite banks, some industry that's going on there. But this actual landscape is actually just a very small area around these couple. There's construction going on either side of the banks. This is back of a farmer's backyard. And in this image, it's actually a new landfill that's being built. Around the actual landfill itself, it's farmland. So the land had been appropriated from farmers in order to create this landfill. I think with this image of the quarry, I kind of think of it as a Chinese painting, because the gravel's been replaced by hills, and in the background you have this little temple. The ground before it, I can imagine it as water. And these, even in farming areas, you'd have trappings of wealth, I suppose, where you have more of these kind of construction that's going on right up to the rural areas of the city. And this actual image of the Yellow River itself, I took this because, and I was afforded this view because of the dam I was standing on. It was China's first dam, and it was hailed as an engineering feat at that time. One of the things I tried to do with this, with I suppose the project, is to try and seduce the viewer with the images. And I think through the text and through the information that contextualizes what you're looking at is to try and kind of realize, for the average person to kind of almost realize all the undercurrents that are affecting what seems a very innocent landscape initially. And in this case, I suppose I quite often think of this image as a dream, but the price of that dream is the dam that I'm standing on. And in a way, on the one hand, you have the dam itself being printed on money as a show of success, but there's a whole load of other issues that, in terms of that's hidden, that you can't see, like the displacement of the people, as well as the people that have been silenced in the process. So I hope you enjoyed it. I seem to be stuck for words this evening. I don't know why, but yeah, this is what I have. Yeah, of course. Much easier.
Are there questions? Yeah.
This is spectacular work. Thank you for sharing it with us. So it seems like there's a big difference between the 35mm photographs you took, some of which had a real grainy movement quality, and they were very peopled, and had a social aspect to them. And then when you went with the panoramic landscapes, and then you say in the second sort of project or set that you were trying to get a more nuanced look, there's a, at least the way you've organized your presentation, and maybe it's the way your work has developed, there's a distinct separation from people, and maybe it's because of the weekend that the week you went and there was no one there, but you give the feeling that you're the only person in the world who's seen these things, which is part of the spectacular impression on us viewing the work. And so I'm wondering if you just want to talk about some of those aspects.
I think in a way that I showed you the work as well is, in a way, kind of, it maps out kind of my progression as a photographer as well. And I think in the early days, what I tried to do was dramatize a situation. I tried to almost imprint my point of view of what was going on inside there. I would always pick up a narrative that I was interested in, and I wasn't interested in necessarily showing the scope of what was there. I'm always frustrated by photography in one sense because it says so much, and at the same time it says so little. It's able to cross boundaries because you don't need language for it. So its greatest power is its ability to emote. But when you actually want to get deeper, you need something else, whether it's text or some kind of support to go with it. And in the early days, what I tried to do to compensate for that was to dramatize the situation, to pick a point of view. And in this case, when I started working with dark clouds in the coal mining areas, I started thinking about how the individual was overwhelmed by the surroundings. And that kind of created a certain set of aesthetic rules for me about how I would operate. I would not necessarily go too close to people to photograph them, even though I had the opportunity. The only time I would go close to them would be only to kind of represent them in this very neutral way. So you would create a kind of tempo within the work that way. As I started to, when I came across these landscapes by accident, because there were no people in there, it made me think about, it's like a diamond having different facets to it. And I was very inspired by, it took me a long while it took me a few projects before I got to working with the panoramics. And I started thinking about how you could actually use these interleaving chapters. So when I presented it within my book, it would start off with, let's say, the landscapes and abstraction, where you saw something that was very beautiful, you'd be drawn into it. And you didn't kind of realize what you were looking at until the later images. Then you started to have a sense that it might be related to industry. Then afterwards, as you go further into the book, you start to see the images from Dark Clouds, which were the 35mm images, and they would contextualize the space that these people were working in. And I took, in a way, one of the things that, when I first thought of that way of actually creating the work in this fashion, I was very excited by it, but I wasn't sure whether it would work. I haven't really shown you that format of how I did that, but it started making me think of a book that I really loved in the past that I'd read, which was by Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. And I remember reading a passage that Steinbeck wrote, and he said that it was a letter that he wrote to a friend, and he said he was so excited because he had this new idea of this way of depicting how he would kind of have these different characteristics to the chapters that he was writing. On the one hand, it would be on a very humanistic level, where you got to know the families that were being affected on a first-name basis and kind of the issues that they were facing. And on the other hand, he would have another chapter that would break these other chapters every now and again, and it would kind of describe a scene as if like you're watching ants from afar or from the top of the hill. And it would use a language that was very impersonal, describing how bulldozers would come along, destroy the homes of these farmers, and you know, it was described in this really beautiful way, but in such a cold, clinical way, and such a contrast to the emotion that was being expressed in the earlier chapters, that the contrast actually heightened the experience of what was happening. And I suppose, without using video, or I love film, movies, but photography doesn't have time. You can't do that. So you have to find other ways to kind of express those kind of ideas. And I think the way I edit my work, the way, in this case, how I explore presenting work with text that doesn't necessarily describe what you're looking at, but some of the things that can't be photographed, I try to create these tensions between the different mediums.
I noticed in your early pictures that you often have a sort of neutral colored background, but there are a lot of things, whether it's a person or an object, that sticks out in a really primary color. You know, bright green or red or something like that. Is that an effect that you tried for to start with, or did that just kind of come out of the pictures that you had?
Okay, so my first trip in 2006 was a complete mess. I went there and I thought, okay, I remember being in a coal mine before, and I thought I'd go back to these same areas and just start exploring it. And I went there, and partly it was difficult to find these mines and gain access to it. The second thing is, when I started shooting it, I realized that the way I was approaching the whole thing was very, very journalistic. And I wanted it to be something else. I wanted it to be impressionistic, even though it was dealing with issues that were essentially documentary or journalistic. And when I came back and I looked at my work, I realized that I couldn't use any of it. It took me almost a year for me to pick up the courage to go back, and then I realized that what I was trying to achieve, I had by that time kind of honed down, in essence, what I was trying to achieve. And so that's why I decided to go out and shoot only during dusk, and I'd go and shoot during winter or at night, because basically it was a way for me to control the light, to make sure that I'd have these muted colors, that everything would be subdued. But the things that I wanted to highlight, these dashes of color, would come about from the time I chose to shoot it, the time of day and the time, you know. Sorry.
I guess just to quickly follow up, if I might, in those same images, oftentimes you have the individuals, I mean, you know, presumably shooting this at a rather slow shutter speed, and the individuals are blurred as if they're in some kind of motion, which sort of stands in contrast to the nature of the rest of the landscape. But I mean, could you describe maybe the decision about wanting to sort of blur in some senses those individual figures?
So yeah, perhaps the best way is to kind of look at the later work as well as those images as well. at that period, I was trying to dramatize situations. So I would say that having a sense of motion gave you a sense of sometimes being there. It would create this impressionistic feeling. And if you look at the later work, almost what I want is the feeling that I'm not influencing how the viewer is seeing the situation. So in a way that the language I'm using, the visual language I'm using, is to kind of think about, is this a more personal point of view where I try to show my presence to the viewer? And in another respect, like even when I shoot 35mm now, quite often everything is just pin sharp. You can see everything from in front to as far back, into the distant landscape. And I would say the aim is to provide this impression that I'm not influencing what's going on. The only way I can influence or direct the viewer's gaze is through the way I edit and through what I choose to frame within the shot. So, yeah.
Could you say more about, I'm interested in the human relationship part of this, both in the images that have people in them and also some of the ones that are so serene and isolated. I would love to hear you say more about how you got access to some of these locations, how you built relationships with people, and then in some of the people environments, sort of how you related to the people and to the environments, whether you made yourself conspicuous or inconspicuous, and just kind of the whole human and social dynamic of your work.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started working, when I was working on the Yangtze, for example, everything was just out there for you to see. So that wasn't really an issue. It was none of it was hidden. But with the coal industry, it was a different matter. And I wasn't. The first time I started working there, I had no idea how to gain access to these places. But in one sense, I was fortunate because many of these industrial complexes had residential areas as well, either within it or near it, and you'd see the public enter and go out, people who live within. So there was a real community that was going on around these places. And it was kind of by trial and error. I'd go and photograph certain places, I'd go inside, I'd meet a miner, I'd talk to them, and then basically, little by little, they would let me in. Sometimes they would just say no, but other times, I think because it's such a dramatic thing that's going on, even when I first came across a coking plant, I think the manager came out and asked me what I was doing. I said, "This is amazing." I told him I was a photographer, and because I wasn't necessarily getting direct permission from, let's say, the big bosses, I would be, it would be just people I encountered in these places. I was able to kind of find my little corner, spend time there, and then however long I worked in that area, if I managed to gain access into that, I mean, that was a big deal, because I wasn't sure whether I was going to gain access the next time round. So I would stay in my little corner and I would not make myself too conspicuous beyond that group, and that was the kind of way I operated. I would go. Sometimes it didn't work out so well, and ironically, what I found when I was working with a bigger format camera, I thought I would be more conspicuous, but the very fact that I was more conspicuous meant that I'd have less questions being asked, because I looked as if I was supposed to be there. so I got less questions, and I thought, I remember thinking to myself, gosh, if I knew this a few years ago, that would have made my life a lot easier.
Thank you so much. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Your shots are really moving. I just was interested in, I couldn't get a sense of time and the temporality of those evictions and the reconstruction of homes. How long, what sort of period, when people were told they had to move, and then you captured that moving so well.
I mean, sometimes it was a matter of basically what they used to do was they would mark out these houses because it would be done in different stages. The first stage was 135 meters above sea level. The next was 150, and then finally 185. And sometimes you would see a mark on the side of the house, and you would see the actual number of the actual height, and that would mark that anything that was below that line was going to be destroyed, and people had to move over a period. They were given a certain amount of time. I'm not sure exactly how many months, but you would also have these red signs that was painted, and it's very common throughout China. You just see the character Chai, which means dismantle, and so that would also be marked around these places. But the thing that was difficult was that the compensation that was supposed to be received, not everyone necessarily got them, because some of it, got embezzled. And you had also people who, whatever they got, they just didn't have enough money necessarily to move. So they were trying to basically work and save money and leave only at the very last moment. So there were people who actually left and came back to homes that they'd already vacated. And that's one of the reasons why all of these, once people vacate, these homes were immediately destroyed or dismantled, so that there was no chance of people coming back to these places.
Let me do some assessment to this affair, okay? Just coincident, I was traveling just the same year with you, but we don't met, right? And actually, it is the right time for people to move to other cities. And the government said, okay, I will give you like half a year or a year to, firstly, to think. The government will give you kind of money that enable you to move to the other cities. Some cities are very nearby. And the other cities, like new built city for citizens to just totally moving. And this amount of money or accommodations are much more, advanced than before. But you can imagine, just urge these people to move their hometown. It is very, very hard. So at that time, I do some oral interview to some residents there, and she's so upset, and she said, okay, you see, I know it's quite a lot of money, but it's no meaning to me, because you see, it's my hometown. My citizens, my ancestors live here for centuries or maybe, and why they urge me to do that? I know I can understand people accept this kind of money because they want to live better, but for me, I don't want. But you see, the sad ending is she must go because the date is there, and just as you see, different height of the waters would come and just destroy everything.
Yeah.
So during this process, I think many photographers went there, but some of them, you see, they were maybe their publications still not to given to the public, and also I think there were a lot of documentaries were taken for this, and anthropologists did this research. Even just they they just trace these people even when they move to the new houses.
Right.
So this is kind of, I think, a great event to modern China, especially related to the hydro policies. So, yeah, I just want to add this background to you. And I think it is even to me, before that, I think it is a good thing. You see, I'm so young that time. And just after traveling along the river, and I see, no, maybe things are different. Especially, you see, there are a lot of historical heritage under the water. But if these waters or flood come, and no historical recordings or documentaries. They were just under the water. So after that, I felt very sad. But I don't know. Even today, Chinese are just they divided to very opposite two parties. Who is opposed to Great Gorges and Three Gorges, and the other said no, it is totally wrong. So we will see, because even today I don't know what exactly data is according to this. Thank you.
So I'm interested that an important part of your technique was being in communities and making yourself, in a sense, part of a community and establishing those relationships. And I think your photographs are incredibly powerful in terms of showing the anonymity and showing the ways in which the individuals are dwarfed. But when I see those new residential buildings going up, not yet finished and not yet populated, it is, my biggest question in some senses is what happens with this sense of migration. I love the moving photos too. What happens to community in this migration, and where do you see community in the in the mills, in the mines, and what does this disruption of with the flooding and the dam building, what does this disruption do to communities, and do you see communities moving together?
I mean, I saw people moving in like, it was always in like small phases, and you never really saw like a whole community getting up and going. It's like everything stayed operational, but everything just kind of like started disassembling bit by bit, and there was always going to be stragglers behind until that basically the area that you were in became just pure rubble. I'm not sure what the timelines were for that. I mean, like the places that I went to, that I visited, I could visit one city and it's practically undamaged, but this next city that's only an hour long would be halfway through that process. And at the same time, when I visited the new cities that were higher up the hills, you would basically see all these new buildings that were already actually starting to age, and I think the conditions were harsh and that they were built at a very quick pace. So you would just see, it was like these ghost cities at the same time, where you had a few people living inside there and no one else had arrived. So there was this limbo stage that where everything was kind of stuck. The people I spoke to in these places, most people initially most of them said they were happy that they had nicer homes in some ways because it was all new, but they also said they lost largely their livelihood. They didn't know how they were going to make do, and everything just had already gotten a lot more expensive for them. So, I mean, in terms of timelines, etc., I'm not sure, but it's just this, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's a comment-ended question, I guess. The first part is I actually was quite struck by some of the imagery, and especially the contrast. I really appreciated the contrast between what you have earlier, especially, and then later on with the panoramics. And some of them actually, struck me as quite similar in aesthetic with some of the more traditional Chinese landscape paintings of the contrast between the natural elements and then the scale between the natural elements and then the human figures. So that was I thought that was wonderful. And the question I have is in terms of migration. So you mentioned that there are a lot of migrant workers who work from place to place and disassembly these homes and things like that. Did you experience, from what you could see anyway, any kind of tension or conflict between the residents of these areas that the migrant workers were going into and in some ways, you know, contributing to this displacement, and in other ways just working and like everyone else is doing around?
That's the thing that impressed me, because many of like the farmers, like for example on the Yangtze River that came, I didn't see anyone. I mean, like the farmers were fairly local. They came from like the opposite valley, etc. They didn't come from very far to do this work, and it was all very matter of fact. And in fact, when you asked people whether they wanted to move or not and how they felt about it, quite often they would say, "Well, what does it matter how I feel? I have to do it anyway." There was very much a resignation as to what was happening, and I think there was that feeling ran across. Like you got that impression, people just got on with how things. It was incredibly matter of fact. It was only until the last stages when I think you can say that there were only a few families around, so there was a sense of perhaps isolation, loneliness, and that will they get the funds enough, or will they be ready enough to leave? Is you know, that would be an issue. But I was very impressed by that fact.
I wonder about your any new projects just to be developed, or maybe being developed now based on this. Any new direction you into?
I think in a way it's like what I hoped by coming here also was to get different perspectives. I mean, one of the things that I find hardest is how to compile almost all of this information in a way that is easily digestible, but gets the weight of what's going on and creates those tensions. So I'd say, you know, I see myself still working on the Yellow River for a while, because I've just come back from the Yellow River Delta. And I think in terms of other works, this is it. This is going to be it for the next year or two at least. You know, yeah.
I'm totally sorry. I'm totally agree with you. It's the picture is kind of like neutral things, and we don't judge ourselves by our previous values or something. So even today, I want to see a lot of provinces in China still living very, very poor, and some of people are just. You see, even to me, when I was graduated students, when I took train to my hometown, there's no there is no seat for us, and you see these normal people, they usually take kind of sheets. You just show us like bamboo sheet. They pull it. They rush to the train and put that under the seats, and just occupy that. It is best place for students like me that time to occupy it. So that is why you see people are rushing and something. So I just want to see there's also still some situations in poor places. That is why I always say China is a complicated and very different country. I think so. Every time we treat it, I think maybe we also will take place comparing to the place, just as African countries. We're very different with each other. That is why I also appreciate that you say you will focus on very neutral things that show the whole pictures and ask us to see background. I think it's very good for everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question about being lost, right? So you have the water coming in and flooding the towns, right? They disappear from materiality. They're gone. They're not gone. They're underwater, right?
No, they're actually completely dismantled.
Dismantled completely. So
Yeah.
there aren't. If someone were to like go,
You
under
won't
the
find
water-
anything. You might find a few odd bricks, but that's
Okay.
why I'd say, like in one of the images I told you, I used to stay in a hotel that was in the background, and it was a thriving city, and that was it. Like 2 years later, completely flat. And even the one where you saw the kid walking across this landscape, so that where he was walking was a city that completely got flattened. You'd have the existing old city as a strip, then you'd have the new city, because in that case they could just walk up the street to go to their new city. But in other cases it's a long it's a long drive up the top, and yeah.
Yeah. So I've seen in other places this flooding process happens, and so this material city disappears. In this case, though, it's remade, and so in other cases, even when a language shift happens, that there's a kind of double death where it leaves signification, where the name changes. The name of the town might change. The name of the town might completely disappear. The name of the town might completely change to a different language. Did you see any of this, these building of new towns or moving of new towns? Did you see kind of that kind of linguistically even in?
I mean, I saw the building of new towns, but they would be called the same names quite often. I mean, basically, most of them kept their old names because the movement was, but a lot of the challenges were the people who were unhappy, and there were isolated areas of protest were coming from farmers, because I mean it's very fertile land around there, and especially the villages, etc. You'd have like, I mean, I would read about it because you never knew when it was going to happen, so I never came across any of that like that I had an opportunity to witness. But these farmers were being totally upset because the land had become fertile over many generations, and now when they actually move up to these higher places, the gradients would be a lot steeper. So many of the places that were being built, there was always the worry of soil erosion and the buildings not being very stable. So.
Thank you for those beautiful images out there, and I think you make the comments about the contrast before and those images that you produced before and then what produced for this current project out there. So in the past, we tried to dramatize the situation and try to get to the point, really review over there and probably influence the viewers as well. But for your later, for the current project, you try to withdraw yourself and then try to engage the viewers to have their sense of the loss or different kind of emotions in your pictures over there. So one of my questions I have here is that here, it was through the New Yorker and through the books and through this kind of talk, we know about this kind of, the photos you made. What about those images in China? Do people have access to those images? How would they think about those images? Do they have this kind of ambiguity that you try to, do they have the impression of this kind of ambiguity of the images?
Yeah, actually, funnily enough, like some of my early work's been published in China quite a few times, and I've exhibited the vanishing and dark clouds there as well in Beijing. So I was kind of surprised that, I mean, I think maybe now in the last couple of years it might be slightly different in terms, I've actually even shown in Shenyang Museum where there's all these industrial places. So it's funny how when people look at the work, especially the mining work, if it's an industrial town, there's almost a certain pride to what went on. So it really comes from the perspective of the viewer, how they see what's going on. I mean, they're absolutely aware of kind of the issues in terms of the environment, but there's a certain pride in terms of the hard work and the labor that goes into these kind of places. But when it's been published in magazines and in exhibition, yeah, I've rarely had issues with it. Although I've had discussions on forums about where some people have kind of misunderstood where I come from with this. The funny thing with this work, and I like to say that in terms of I think about layers of information, visual information, and with what I did in Dark Clouds, there's this feeling like you want people to experience, like to immerse themselves in the actual atmosphere itself. And so the purpose of dramatizing the work and shooting it in a particular way creates or accentuates those feelings. But in doing a kind of more neutral set of images, but having these kind of texts that go below, there's this kind of, you receive information in kind of two layers, or a few layers. The first layer is this seduction process where you first fall in love with what's going on, and then you start to see the other information that's related to what's there. And I've had people more upset by the latest work than the earlier work, which was the complete opposite intention of what I was trying to do. Because when I exhibited and showed work like this, one of the things that I stated was like, I wanted my work to be able to be in China very openly, and I wanted to draw to the fact that the cultural significance of the river, the way it's being talked about within the society, there's this 5,000-year history. It's been in the arts, poetry, etc. There's this kind of love for it, but there's also another alternate reality that's not being it's recognized now, but it's that they're kind of in contrast with each other. So by actually having these kind of two types of information that's being delivered, there's this strong dissonance that's going on inside there. And funnily enough, that's the reason why I've had stronger reactions to this work.
Can you show us a photograph that's powerful for you and talk about it? If there's any that stands out, either because of your experience taking it or how it turned out, or
that's a hard one. I love many of the images for many different reasons. Quite often I think it's this, like when I worked, I think it's easier for me to talk about sets of work because like in Dark Clouds it's when I felt like I'd reached this shift in understanding how I could control and guide, like create an atmosphere that ran throughout the whole body of work. One of my frustrations when I first started working in color in photography, and that was back in the late 90s, there wasn't really much color work that was going on around. Like what you saw in the magazines wasn't very inspiring for me because it felt like color was almost an accident. Because you saw a lot of good black and white work, but somehow when photographers used color, it wasn't an integral part of the whole composition. It wasn't part of it. It was almost a distraction to what was going on there. And when I looked at until the people introduced me to some other color photographers that I really admired, I remember I did this one trip to Hong Kong, and it was the first time that I decided to shoot in color. And prior to that, I loved black and white photography, and I had no interest in color. In fact, I was actually quite petrified at the idea that I'd be shooting in color. And the reason why I started in color was because I was going to work on a project with a friend where we would have these two different, like he would shoot in black and white, I'd shoot in color, and we'd try and combine it into a project of some sort. And he had gone the other way from color to black and white. So he said, it's down to you if you we're going to do this thing. And I remember going to Hong Kong and thinking about these problems, these kind of creative problems I had. And I said, and it struck me that from the problems that I described, I remember thinking during art college, I was given a piece. I love drawing, and I love drawing in a very academic way, in full detail, cross-hatching, all of those things. But my tutor would give me a charcoal, and told me to tie it to a piece of stick and draw with that. And of course, that loss of control was a huge amount of frustration for someone who loved detail. And I nearly didn't get through my foundation course because I was so stuck in the things that I really loved doing. And the whole idea or the purpose of that particular course was to kind of open your mind to other possibilities. But it was never they never told you that was what was supposed to be happening. They just told you to do it. So I was like, it's like, why? And I came across this book, and it basically talked about, I can't, for the life of me, I can't remember what that book was called, but this guy talked about how he wanted you to experience drawing and not how to draw academically well. And through that, he gave this idea that I would be doing a series of exercises, whether it be 1-minute sketches, an hour, or so on, and I might look at what I was drawing, but not look at the paper. The results were vastly different, and it had its own kind of beauty and aesthetic. So when I went to Hong Kong and I started working, deciding I wanted to do a portrait of the city in the night, I picked an area, but it made me realize that all the kind of constraints and rules that you had in photography, I had to break them. I had to break them for myself in order to find what came out of it. So a lot of the time when I was shooting, I didn't know what was going on. I would shoot on incredibly slow shutter speeds. So the results were all in a bag of film that I only, over time, looking at it, I started to realize that the ones that were kind of had mistakes in them had a different quality about it. And some of those qualities I could actually use, or I could learn to control them. So that's how I started to develop this kind of way of working where I'd be using blur, I'd be using all these things to try and actually create this language or this world that indirect way.
It looks like we have probably time for two more questions. You and then you.
I really liked they were all beautiful, but I really liked kind of the contrast of seeing the expansive landscapes, and then when you would show the individual portraits of a lot of the miners and just how personal it felt after seeing, from the distance and going really personal. And kind of going back to, like at the start of the presentation, talking about the transactional costs of national dreams.
Yeah.
So when you were building these connections and these relationships with these miners, when you spoke with them, did they feel like they were contributing to a national dream? Or
I suppose that's my kind of interpretation based on my conversations with them. Like there's obviously the narrative that I get from reading what I read in the media, and then there's what I sense from actually conversations that I have with these miners, etc. And most of them, they're there just to kind of carve out a better lifestyle. I mean, the average Chinese person at that time, their carbon footprint was like about 4 tons a year versus 15 tons over here. And so if I was living their life, I'd be doing probably a very similar thing. I'd be looking for the best paid job that was available. Yeah, so in a way and you got that sense traveling and for some of the years when I was living in China, you got that sense that there was this, it's kind of like, I suppose, the Wild West in the US, the opportunity to really create I mean, for me, from the way I saw it, it was like an opportunity to kind of create a better life. And these new economic policies allowed for all of that, and it's the one thing that you could be free to pursue. And everyone was doing it, right down to the migrant worker who was traveling all the way to Shanghai or Beijing and would live, you know, for 1 year without seeing their families, you know. So many of the miners, actually, I just want to go back to, maybe I can find it here. I wanted to show this image in relation to an earlier question we also to answer. So this image here, so my taxi driver who I'd been, one of the things I do is every time I arrive in a place, I don't know how to, I have a map, I find a taxi driver who's friendly and knows the place relatively well. And then we go driving around all over the place looking for things, places and things that I find interesting. And he was a miner before. So he said, I can take you to my old mine. You know, I can introduce you to the coal mine boss and you can go inside. So I said, great, okay, so let's go. And so all of these guys, most of them, you know, unless something terrible had happened and you meet someone who's ill or unwell because of that, I don't know, I was always struck by their kind of matter-of-factness, their positivity, and just getting on with life. So this one image is to answer your question is one of my favorite images for that because of the backstory that comes with it. So I was allowed to wander around the mine and no one chaperoned me. So I said that's perfect, you know. So I saw the shaft that was going down there, and most of the workers were actually walking down through the shaft. So it wasn't going that deep. So I decided I'd go down there as well and walk down there. And the second shift for the evening was about to start. So at the bottom of the shaft, it wasn't that deep. I just kind of waited there. And all these workers would come and they'll be surprised by my presence when I turned up, you know, or when they saw me, say, what are you doing here? I said, oh, I'm just here to take pictures, etc. You know, your boss let me in, you know. and I'd stand there, wait, and then they'll let me take pictures there. But it was incredibly dark in that place. And one of the things that I decided not to do when I was shooting this project was I wouldn't use flash. So, how do I light this? So I remember standing there, and these three guys came along, and when they heard that I wanted to take their pictures, they became like kids, you know, they were getting all really excited, and I said, well, I want to just do individual portraits of you, you know, so I need you to stand, and I positioned him, and there was this backlight that was going on there because that was lighting the tunnel, so I placed them just so that it would just kind of create a halo behind there, and then I thought, well, there's no light on his face, so I said, you guys have to light your lamps and shine it on him. so they lit, and of course they didn't know anything, so they were lighting it everywhere. So I said, no, you stand here, point that in that direction. So there were these kind of like human tripods with holding lights, and I just positioned them in all this way. And I spent like about 10 minutes photographing all of these guys doing, and this is the one that came out. Yeah, like some of them were just too happy and smiley, and there was just no gravitas. But this guy, he was so serious, but it was a kind of pride. He knew he was having his portrait taken, so he just kind of snapped up to attention and just looked straight into the camera. So, and it's that connection you get. If you're lucky, you get it for a moment, and then you know it's you get 1 or 2 frames that works, and then. That's it.
Is this digital or 35 millimeter here?
All of this was all in 35mm film, yeah. So you didn't know whether you had it.
Yeah.
Okay, you
No, you can. I'm not kicking you out. I'm putting him in. There's time for both of you.
Or additive.
Yeah.
So, though I'm not the right person to comment on this kind of art thing, but I want to just have a query, like, or you may say an observation. Like if I take this as a montage, or if you try to give it a narrative form, then there are something which remain unsaid. You have just pointed out the gaps. And can we say that you left it open-ended?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I always feel that the strength of photography is really its ability to ask questions. So you draw the viewer in, and in order for the viewer to actually have this mental journey that's going on inside their heads, the photograph can't complete itself. There needs to be enough in there that people will want to know more, so that they go beyond the boundaries of the frame. So the photograph is just a starting point.
But actually, I do have a question, but I really wanted to quickly mention another story happening in my experience when you talk about the story associated with that. A few years ago, I went to a field trip with another photographer. He works for New York Times and Washington Post back then. And when we went to in middle of Hunan province and shooting some Taoist ritual, and then the entire village heard there was a photographer there, and then so the Taoist master made a request to have a funeral photo made. So once that done, the entire village, even the village across the mountain, the hill, all of them flocked in. Basically said, we want to have our funeral photos taken. And throughout the day, and then they were so serious. They dress up and they sit down and really make everything so proper. And 2 years later, we returned for the same field work, and they asked, where are our photos? So it's a little story, but I want to really be quick with my question. So actually following your question, I was really thinking, yes, your images, your works are left open-ending and ended, leaving for left for interpretation, and yet sometimes I wonder, you being a photographer and at the same time you're wearing another hat or maybe several other hats, especially as long as you are gaining recognition and even fame and people put you there to speak, and the people want to hear not interpretation or open-ended question, future, but conclusions. And I wonder whether or not you've encountered those situations. People want you to become a China watcher, a China expert, to provide conclusions. How do you cope with that? Yeah, how do you deal with that?
Well, thankfully, I haven't come across that position. I definitely have my own points of view, but my personal views are also constantly shifting. Even with the works, from the way I started the project and how I interpret or feel about the work at the end. So I think I can't answer that part of it about how I would handle it, because I've never had to handle that. But I feel like even within the lifetime of a project, my growth as a person in terms of how I feel about the work and how I interpret it changes as well. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of shooting these landscapes the way I am, is because my feeling, it feels a lot more nuanced, and that's what I'm trying to look for. Yeah.
Well, thank you so very, very much.